The first sign of trouble was Carol Peterson's smile. It was a perfectly pleasant, neighborly smile, the kind one practiced in a mirror. But it never quite reached the cool gray of her eyes as she paused before the trellis. It was the annual Architectural Control Committee walkthrough for the Lakeside Meadows Homeowners Association, a ritual of forced congeniality and simmering resentment. John Morgan, a man who had navigated far more hostile territories in his 20 years of service, felt a familiar prickle of unease. "Good morning, John," Carol said, her voice a precise, clipped instrument. She held a clipboard like a scepter. Beside her, two other board members, Stan and Brenda, nodded with the placid obedience of well-trained courtiers. "Everything is looking quite lovely. The lawn is immaculate, as always." "Thank you, Carol," John replied, his hands tucked into the pockets of his worn jeans. He stood on his own front porch, a small concrete slab that felt, under her gaze, like contested ground. Carol's smile tightened a fraction as her eyes fixed on the simple, wooden structure against the side of his house. It was a lattice of weathered cedar, intertwined with the dormant vines of a climbing rose Maria had planted the first year they moved in. It was more than a garden feature. It was a monument. "The trellis," she said, the two words landing with the weight of an indictment. "It's very rustic." John felt his jaw tense. Maria built it. She loved her roses. "I'm sure she did," Carol said, a note of performative sympathy in her voice that grated on John's nerves. "However, as we've discussed in recent board meetings, we are making a concerted effort to uphold the aesthetic integrity of the community, specifically regarding the preservation of view corridors as defined in the covenants, conditions, and restrictions." She tapped her pen on the clipboard. "This structure, lovely as its sentiment may be, appears to encroach upon the view corridor from the common area path over there." She gestured vaguely toward the sidewalk that snaked behind his property line. John looked from the trellis to the path. There was no discernible view to obstruct, save for the beige vinyl siding of his other neighbor's house. "Carol, that trellis has been there for 15 years. It's never been an issue. And for 15 years, we've had a certain laxity in enforcement," she countered smoothly. "The new board is committed to applying the governing documents as they were written. For everyone, equally." The emphasis on the final words was a clear, public warning. Several neighbors, pretending to inspect their own flower beds, were now openly listening. The humiliation was a deliberate tool, a public shaming designed to ensure compliance. John took a slow breath, forcing the discipline of his past to govern his present. An emotional response was a tactical error. "I'd be happy to review the relevant section of the CC&Rs," he said, his tone even, "if you could point me to the specific article. I'll take a look." Carol's smile finally vanished, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. She had expected capitulation, not a request for citation. "Of course. John, we'll have the management company send you the appropriate documentation. We're just giving everyone a friendly, informal heads up today." She made a neat checkmark on her clipboard, the scratch of the pen unnervingly loud in the quiet morning air. She turned to her companions. "All right, let's move on to the Hendersons' unapproved satellite dish." As they walked away, John remained on his porch, his gaze fixed on the trellis. The bare, thorny canes of the rosebush looked like tangled wire. He could almost smell the phantom scent of the summer blossoms, a scent inextricably linked with Maria's laughter. This wasn't about a view. This wasn't about a rule. This was an invasion, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was only the beginning. The house was too quiet. It was a silence that had its own physical weight, pressing in on John from the empty rooms. the still air thick with memory. 18 months had passed since Maria's heart had simply given out, and the silence had only grown louder. He was a retired logistics officer, a man who had spent his life managing systems, supply chains, and the orderly movement of people and materials. Now, his primary logistical challenge was navigating the vast, unstructured emptiness of his own grief. He ran a hand over the smooth, cool granite of the kitchen counter. Maria had picked it out, spending weeks comparing samples until she found the perfect one. A dark green, flecked with silver that reminded her of a forest after the rain. Every surface, every object in the house was a chapter in their shared story. The worn armchair where she read, the collection of ceramic birds on the mantelpiece, the meticulously organized sewing room upstairs, they were all artifacts of a life that felt impossibly distant. His relationship with his son, David, had become another casualty of that silence. David was a detective in the city, a world of sirens and urgency that felt a million miles away from the manicured lawns of Lakeside Meadows. Their phone calls were brief, stilted affairs, exercises in avoidance. They talked about the weather, David's caseload in vague, professional terms, and John's latest VA checkup. They never talked about the one thing that connected them most, the gaping hole Maria had left behind. Grief had built a wall between them, and neither man knew how to breach it. John knew David worried, but saw him as fragile. An old soldier, broken not by war, but by loss. He didn't want to add the petty grievance of an HOA dispute to his son's burdens. John's sanctuary, his last defensible position, was Maria's garden. He'd taken over her duties with military precision, learning the arcane language of soil pH, pruning schedules, and pest control. It was there, among the roses and hydrangeas, that he felt closest to her, and the trellis was the heart of it all. He remembered the weekend she'd built it, her face smudged with sawdust, her eyes bright with accomplishment. It needs to be strong enough to hold a whole summer of beauty. John, she'd said, now. It felt like it was holding the last vestiges of his life with her. He knew a little about Carol Peterson. She had moved in 2 years ago and ascended to the board presidency with a speed that suggested a vacuum of power and a surfeit of ambition. She was a real estate agent, a fact she mentioned frequently, and she spoke of property values and curb appeal with a religious fervor. To Carol, a home wasn't a sanctuary, it was an asset. A neighborhood wasn't a community, it was a portfolio. Her focus on his trellis, he suspected, had little to do with a non-existent view and everything to do with her vision of a homogenized, perfectly marketable suburbia. There was something personal in her gaze, though, a targeted intensity that he couldn't quite decipher. It felt less like a policy decision and more like a personal campaign. His closest friend in the neighborhood, Mark, a fellow retiree who lived 3 doors down, saw it too. Watch yourself with her, John. Mark had warned him over coffee a few months back. She's all smiles and bylaws, but she's got the soul of a compliance officer. She sees a nail sticking up. She's got to hammer it down. And right now, for whatever reason, you're the nail. John had dismissed it then as neighborly gossip. Now, Carol's words from the walkthrough echoed in his mind. The new board is committed to applying the governing documents as they were written. It was the classic refrain of the petty tyrant, using the sterile language of rules to justify a personal exercise of power. He went to the bookshelf and pulled out the thick 3-ring binder that contained the Lakeside Meadows CC&Rs. It was a dense, impenetrable brick of legalese they'd been given at closing 20 years ago. As he thumbed through the pages, a slip of paper fell out. It was a sticky note in Maria's elegant cursive. FARA 8.4, Easements and Restricted Areas. His breath caught. She had been looking at this very section. He found the page. And there, next to a paragraph on view corridor preservation, was another of her notes, written in the margin in faint pencil check original plat map. A week passed. The silence in the house was punctuated by a new sound, the low hum of anxiety. John found himself watching the street from his window, tensing every time the mail truck made its slow progress down the block. He told himself he was being ridiculous. It was a trellis, a piece of wood. But he knew it was more than that. It was a test, a first move in a game he didn't want to play. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. It wasn't in a standard envelope. It came in a 9x12 mailer, stiff, with official purpose. The return address was that of the HOA's management company, a faceless entity in a corporate park 20 miles away. His name and address were printed below the ominous words, VIA certified mail, return receipt requested. He signed the postman's digital scanner with a hand that was not entirely steady. The weight of the envelope was disproportionate to its size. He carried it into the kitchen and set it on the granite counter, staring at it as if it were an unexploded ordnance. He made a cup of coffee, his movements deliberate and slow, delaying the inevitable. Finally, he slit the envelope open with a kitchen knife. The letter was 2 pages long, printed on heavy bond paper with the HOA's letterhead at the top. The language was cold, impersonal, and utterly devoid of the neighborly pretense Carol had employed during the walkthrough. Official notice of violation. Date October 17, 2023. Property 124 Chestnut Lane. Owner John Morgan. Dear Mr. Morgan, this letter serves as formal notification that your property is in violation of the covenants, conditions, and restrictions CC&Rs for the Lakeside Meadows Homeowners Association. During a routine inspection by the Architectural Control Committee ACC on October 10, 2023, it was observed that a non-compliant structure, a wooden trellis, has been erected on the western side of your private lot. This structure constitutes a violation of the following article. Article 8, Section 8.4.2, View Corridor Preservation. No structure, planting, or other material shall be placed or permitted to remain upon any lot or common area, which may damage or interfere with any established easement for utilities, or which unreasonably obstructs the view from any adjacent lot or common area as designated on the recorded plat map of the community. The aforementioned trellis obstructs the designated view corridor from the common area walking path located behind your property. Per the association's enforcement policy, you are hereby required to cure this violation within 14 days of the date of this notice. Curing the violation requires the complete removal of the non-compliant structure. Failure to cure the violation by October 31, 2023, will result in further enforcement action by the Board of Directors, which may include the levying of monetary fines and/or legal action, all costs of which will be the sole responsibility of the homeowner. Should you wish to dispute this violation, you may request a hearing before the Board of Directors by submitting a written request to the management company within 10 days. Sincerely, the Lakeside Meadows Board of Directors, CAO Sterling Management Solutions. John read the letter 3 times. The words seemed to blur, the legalese forming a smokescreen for the raw aggression beneath. Non-compliant structure. Cure this violation. Complete removal. They were talking about Maria's trellis as if it were a pile of hazardous waste. The threat was no longer implied. It was printed, dated, and delivered by the United States Postal Service. The memory of her, laughing as she hammered the last cedar plank into place, rose in his mind, sharp and painful. Removing the trellis would be like digging up a piece of her. It was a desecration. He looked at the date. 14 days. The clock was ticking. The battle had been formally declared. John's first instinct was to fight back with reason. He was a man who believed in process, in the logical progression of communication. He spent an evening composing a polite, carefully worded email to the generic address for Sterling Management Solutions. He attached photos of the trellis, photos of the view it supposedly obstructed, and a scanned copy of his original property survey, which made no mention of a specific view corridor in that location. He explained the history of the structure and respectfully requested that the board reconsider the violation. A week went by with no response beyond an automated confirmation of receipt. The silence from the management company was a form of bureaucratic warfare, a deliberate, frustrating inertia. His next step was to attend the monthly board meeting. The meetings were held in the community clubhouse, a sterile beige room that smelled faintly of chlorine from the adjacent pool. John sat in the back, one of a half-dozen homeowners in attendance, most of whom were there to complain about parking or noisy neighbors. Carol presided over the meeting with an unnerving efficiency, moving through the agenda items with a brisk pace that discouraged discussion. When the floor was opened for homeowner comments, John stood up. He introduced himself and calmly stated his case, referencing his email and the lack of response. Carol listened with an expression of patient condescension. "Thank you for your comments, John," she said when he finished. "As we've noted, the board is enforcing the CC&Rs as written, the ACC, under the authority granted by the bylaws, has identified a violation. The process from here is quite clear. If you wish to formally dispute it, you must request a hearing, as outlined in the letter you received." "But the rule itself is being misapplied," John pressed, trying to keep the frustration out of his voice. "There is no significant view to obstruct, and I've noticed other structures that are far more intrusive." "Stan," he said, nodding toward the board member at the end of the table, "your new tool shed is twice the size of my trellis and sits right on the property line." A murmur went through the small audience. Stan flushed a deep red. Carol's eyes narrowed. "We are not here to discuss other properties, John. We are discussing the violation at 124 Chestnut Lane. The committee's decision stands. If you have no other relevant comments, we need to move on to the treasurer's report." It was a public dismissal, a masterclass in bureaucratic stonewalling. He had been shut down, his evidence ignored, his questions deflected. He sat down, his face burning. He looked at the other board members. They stared at their papers, refusing to make eye contact. They were either complicit or intimidated. Either way, it was clear that Carol was in complete control. As the meeting droned on, John realized the terrifying truth of his situation. The rules, the process, the entire machinery of the HOA. It wasn't a system for ensuring fairness. In Carol's hands, it was a weapon, and it was pointed directly at him. "She's isolating you, John. That's the first step in this kind of campaign." Mark sat across from him at the kitchen table, a half-empty coffee mug in his hand. "Shut you down in public. Make it seem like you're the unreasonable one. Classic playbook." "She wouldn't even look at my evidence," John said, shaking his head in disbelief. "It's like the facts don't matter." "The facts don't matter to people like her," Mark said, his voice grim. "Power matters. Control matters. You're not fighting the rule. You're fighting her. So, you have to fight smart. You have to fight by the book. Their book." He leaned forward. "You're a veteran, John. Think of this as an intelligence-gathering operation. You need to know the enemy's position and capabilities. You need to know the terrain." Mark's words sparked something in him, a flicker of the old strategic mindset that had been dormant for years. Grief had made him passive. Carol's aggression was forcing him to be a soldier again. "The first thing you do," Mark continued, "is make a formal request. In writing. For records. Meeting minutes for the past 2 years. All financial statements. And any and all correspondence related to ACC enforcement. They are legally obligated to provide them, though they'll probably drag their feet and redact the hell out of them. But it's a start. It shows you're not backing down." That evening, John drafted another letter. This one citing the state laws governing homeowner access to association records. He sent it via certified mail, just like theirs. It felt like a return volley in a long-distance artillery duel. While he waited, he turned his attention back to Maria's cryptic note, "Check original plat map." He had her old files, dozens of boxes stored neatly in the attic, a testament to her meticulous nature. He spent a weekend up there, surrounded by the ghosts of their life together, tax returns from the 90s, instruction manuals for obsolete appliances, photo albums filled with faded smiles. The dust motes dancing in the single beam of light from the attic window felt like floating memories. In a box labeled House, Closing and Permits, he found their original closing documents from 20 years ago, but the plat map included was a small, grainy photocopy, a developer's overview of the entire subdivision with little detail. This wasn't what Maria meant. It had to be something more specific. He moved on to another set of boxes, these labeled garden projects. He found her detailed plans for the vegetable garden, sketches for the stone pathway he'd helped her lay, and receipts for hundreds of dollars worth of plants. And there, at the bottom of a box filled with seed catalogs, he found it. It was a large, rolled-up tube of heavy paper, bound with a brittle rubber band. He carefully slid the band off and unrolled the document on the floor. It was the original survey and plat map of their specific lot. Lot 72 prepared for the first owner and filed with the county recorder's office. It was a beautiful, hand-drawn document, filled with precise measurements, elevation markers, and the clear, unambiguous lines of property boundaries. And, along the back of the property, there was a dotted line with a clear notation, 10D, Public Utility Easement. There was no mention of a view corridor. He scanned the entire document, his finger tracing every line and every notation. Nothing. He stood up and went back to the CC&Rs. To the highlighted section 8.4.2, unreasonably obstructs the view from any adjacent lot or common area as designated on the recorded plat map of the community. As designated on the recorded plat map. John stared at the map on his floor, then back at the words in the binder. The violation wasn't a misinterpretation. It was a lie, a complete and utter fabrication, anchored to a non-existent designation on a map she had clearly never bothered to check, or, more chillingly, had checked and decided to ignore. A cold wave washed over him. This wasn't about aesthetic integrity or applying the rules. This wasn't just a power trip. This was a targeted, malicious attack, built on a foundation of deliberate falsehood. The question was no longer how to fight it. The question was why. Why go to such lengths to harass him over a simple garden trellis? Armed with the plat map, John felt a surge of confidence. This was the irrefutable proof he needed. He took a high-resolution photograph of the map, highlighted the absence of any view corridor designation, and attached it to a new, more forceful email to the management company and the board. He laid out his case with the precision of a legal brief, quoting the CC&Rs and contrasting them with the factual evidence of the official, recorded document. He demanded that the violation notice be rescinded immediately. The response, when it came, was not a letter of apology. It was an escalation. A few days later, another certified letter arrived. It was a formal notice of hearing. He was being summoned to appear before the board to plead his case. The letter stated that if he did not attend, a decision would be made in his absence. It was a summons to a kangaroo court. Attached to the hearing notice was a letter from an attorney, a Mr. Davies, representing the HOA. It was a masterpiece of legal intimidation. Mr. Davies's letter dismissed John's plat map as an unverified document of uncertain provenance and stated that the board was relying on the community's master plan, a document they conveniently failed to produce. The letter concluded by strongly advising Mr. Morgan to comply with the violation notice to avoid the significant legal and financial repercussions of continued non-compliance. The pressure was mounting, a systematic tightening of the screws. He was being pushed into a corner, his evidence dismissed, his character implicitly questioned. The lien. That was the HOA's ultimate weapon. He knew from the bylaws that unpaid fines could quickly turn into a lien against his property, a black mark on his title that could prevent him from selling or refinancing. It was a threat to the very roof over his head, the home that held every memory of Maria, the home that was his only real asset. The fear was real now, a cold knot in his stomach. This was the point where most people would give in. The cost, the stress, the sheer exhaustion of fighting a faceless bureaucracy backed by lawyers. It was designed to wear you down. John sat at his kitchen table, the lawyer's letter in his hand, and considered it. He could take down the trellis. It would take an afternoon. The harassment would stop. He could retreat back into the quiet shell of his grief. Then he thought of Maria, her face bright with pride as she'd surveyed her handiwork. He thought of her quiet strength, her unshakable sense of right and wrong. She would never have backed down. And he couldn't either. He picked up the phone book, the old paper kind he still kept by the telephone. He looked under surveyors. He needed more than a decades-old map. He needed a weapon of his own, an official, certified, and legally unassailable statement of fact. He found a listing for an independent firm and dialed the number. Albright Land Surveying. A crisp, professional voice answered. "How can I help you?" "My name is John Morgan," he said, his voice steadier than he expected. "I need to hire you to perform a certified boundary and easement survey on my property." The visit from Ms. Albright was a breath of fresh, objective air. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, with a confident stride and eyes that seemed to be constantly measuring angles. She didn't ask about his dispute with the HOA. She was interested only in data. For 2 hours, she and her assistant moved around his property with sophisticated electronic equipment, taking readings, planting temporary stakes, and consulting a ruggedized tablet displaying county records. 2 days later, a report arrived in his inbox. It was a multi-page PDF, stamped with Ms. Albright's official seal as a licensed state surveyor. It confirmed, in the precise, unambiguous language of her profession, what he already knew. It detailed the exact location and dimensions of the 10-foot public utility easement. And it stated, with absolute certainty, a thorough review of all recorded plats, deeds, and easement documents associated with Lot 72, 124 Chestnut Lane, filed with the Anytown County Recorder's Office, reveals no designation, mention, or existence of a view corridor easement on, across, or adjacent to the property in question. He printed it out, the paper warm from the printer. It felt heavier than all the HOA's threatening letters combined. It was the truth, certified and sealed. Before the hearing, the final piece of Carol's strategy clicked into place. John received a call from Mr. Davies, the HOA attorney. His tone was surprisingly conciliatory. "Mr. Morgan," Davies began, "the board is prepared to offer a resolution. They are willing to grant you a permanent variance for your trellis, rescinding the violation and waiving all potential fines. John was stunned. "What's the catch?" "No catch," the lawyer said smoothly. "Just a simple gesture of community goodwill. The board is introducing a new rule at the next meeting regarding recreational equipment. It simply requires that things like portable basketball hoops be stored out of sight after 9 p.m. It's a minor aesthetic rule. Really, all the board asks is that, in exchange for your variance, you speak in favor of the new rule at the hearing. A simple statement of support." John immediately knew who the rule was targeting. Sarah, the young single mother who lived on the corner lot, had a basketball hoop for her 2 sons. She worked late, and the boys often played until dusk. Forcing her to put it away every night would be a significant hardship. He'd seen Carol watching Sarah's house with that same predatory focus she'd given his trellis. This was a trade. His peace for Sarah's. Sacrifice his neighbor to save himself. "No," John said, the word tasting like freedom. "I won't do that." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "That's unfortunate." "Mr. Morgan," Davies said, the warmth vanishing from his voice. "I'll see you at the hearing." John hung up the phone. Now he understood. This wasn't just about him. It was about control. It was about making sure everyone in the community knew who was in charge. His victory wouldn't be just for him and Maria's memory. It had to be for Sarah, too. It had to be for everyone. The clubhouse was packed. Word of the showdown had spread through the neighborhood's grapevine, and the room buzzed with the energy of a public spectacle. The board of directors sat at a long table on a slightly raised platform, a panel of suburban deities about to pass judgment. Carol was in the center, flanked by her board, her expression a mask of serene impartiality. A representative from the management company sat at a small table to the side, acting as a procedural warden. John sat in the front row, a single manila folder resting on his lap. Beside him, Mark gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze. In the third row, he saw Sarah, her 2 young sons beside her, her face a mixture of hope and fear. "We will now hear the violation appeal for 124 Chestnut Lane," Carol announced, her voice amplified by a small microphone. "Mr. Morgan, you have requested this hearing. As per our bylaws, you have 5 minutes to present your case. The time will be kept by our management representative." The representative held up a small digital timer and placed it on the table, its red numbers glowing 0500. The countdown began. John walked to the lectern, the folder in his hand. He felt the eyes of his neighbors on him, felt the weight of their expectations. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a slow, heavy beat against his collar. He took a deep breath and looked directly at Carol. "Good evening," he began, his voice calm and clear. He placed his folder on the lectern. "My name is John Morgan, and I am here to address the violation notice issued against my property." The timer clicked to 04:45. "First," he said, pulling out the violation letter, "this is the notice I received. Claiming a trellis my late wife built 15 years ago is in violation of the rules." He then held up a series of photographs. And these are photos, taken yesterday, of at least a dozen other properties, including some belonging to board members with unapproved sheds, non-compliant fences, and other structures far larger than my trellis. This establishes a clear pattern of arbitrary and selective enforcement. A murmur rippled through the room. The timer showed 04:10. "Second," he continued, his pacing deliberate. "The violation notice cites Section 8.4.2 of our CC&Rs. He pulled out another sheet. "I have the text of that section here. It states that a structure cannot obstruct a view as designated on the recorded plat map of the community." The key phrase there is "as designated." He paused. letting the words sink in. The timer read 03:30. For weeks, I have operated under the assumption that the board was simply mistaken. So I retrieved the original plat map for my lot, filed with the county. He unfurled a copy of the map and held it up. As you can see, it clearly designates a public utility easement. It makes no designation of any kind for a view corridor. He then looked toward the back of the room. But you don't have to take my word for it. He nodded toward Ms. Albright, who stood up briefly. That is Ms. Albright, a licensed state land surveyor. I hired her to produce a certified report. He placed the bound report on the lectern with a solid thud. This report, sealed and legally binding, confirms there is no view corridor easement on my property. The HOA's claim is factually, legally, and definitively baseless. The timer showed WO2 WO0. The room was silent now, a thick, expectant quiet. So, this leads to the obvious question, John said, his voice dropping slightly, drawing everyone in. If the violation is a fabrication, what is the real reason for this harassment? Why the refusal to look at evidence? Why the threats of liens against the home I shared with my wife for 20 years? He picked up his final document. It was a copy of the board meeting minutes he had received after his formal request. Large portions were blacked out with a marker. I believe the answer may lie in the minutes from the board's executive session on May 12th of this year minutes, which I see have been heavily redacted. He held the blacked-out page high for everyone to see. These redactions cover a discussion on potential property acquisitions. I have also acquired, through a public records request, copies of emails between our board president and a representative from a commercial development firm that has been trying to acquire residential lots bordering the highway for a new retail project. My lot is one of those properties. He looked directly at Carol, whose face had gone from serene to sheet white. This was never about a trellis. This was a bad faith campaign of harassment, using the HOA's power as a cudgel, to try and force an old man out of his home so you could facilitate a sale for a developer. The digital timer on the table blinked 0005, 0004, 0003. My time is up, John said quietly, and returned to his seat. The silence in the clubhouse was absolute. It was as if John had pulled a pin from a grenade and rolled it onto the board's table. Every eye in the room was fixed on Carol Peterson, whose composure had finally shattered, her face a pale, frozen mask of fury and shock. Then, a voice broke the quiet. It was Sarah, the single mother. She stood up, her hands trembling slightly, but her voice was strong. She did the same thing to me, Sarah said, her words cutting through the tension. I got a violation for my son's basketball hoop, then another for my garden hose being visible from the street. It was constant. I was afraid I was going to be fined into debt. An older man in the back stood up. I got 3 notices in 1 month about the paint on my trim. I've lived here 30 years and never had a problem until she became president. Suddenly, the dam broke. A dozen voices rose at once, a chorus of grievances about selective enforcement, arbitrary fines, and a culture of intimidation that had descended on the community over the past year. It was a full-blown insurrection, unfolding in real time. Stan, the board member John had called out for his shed, saw the tide turning. He cleared his throat nervously. I believe, in light of the surveyor's report, that we should, table this violation indefinitely. He wouldn't look at Carol. Table it, Mark boomed from his seat. You should be issuing a formal apology. I make a motion to immediately rescind the violation notice and all associated threats of fines against Mr. Morgan. Second came a half-dozen voices at once, Carol tried to regain control. "This is out of order," she began, but her voice was lost in the noise. "And I make another motion," Mark yelled over the din. "I move for a full, independent financial audit of this association's books for the last 2 years. And I move for a special meeting to hold a recall vote for the office of board president." The room erupted in applause. The management representative, looking terrified, scribbled furiously, trying to keep up with the motions. The board, except for Carol, voted in favor of everything, their survival instincts overriding any loyalty they might have had. The fine was reversed. The violation was dismissed. The audit and the recall vote were scheduled in the span of 10 minutes. An entire power structure had been dismantled by a certified surveyor's report and a quiet man's resolve. Carol Peterson sat motionless, her reign over, publicly and humiliatingly defeated. In the weeks that followed, the changes in Lakeside Meadows were swift and decisive. Carol Peterson was removed from the board in a landslide recall vote. The independent audit uncovered a slush fund and several questionable contracts awarded to a landscaping company owned by Carol's brother-in-law. The management company, facing a lawsuit from a newly energized community, was fired. A new board was elected, comprised of residents, including a reluctant John Morgan, who had become a folk hero. He didn't want the power, but he felt a duty to ensure no one else would have to endure what he had. He spearheaded a new transparency committee, dedicated to making the HOA's operations clear, fair, and accountable to the residents it served. One cool autumn evening, months after the hearing, John was finally cleaning out the last of Maria's old desk. The house was still quiet, but it was a different kind of silence now, a peaceful one, not a heavy one. He found an old file folder tucked away in the bottom drawer, labeled simply Zoning. Curious. He opened it. Inside was a collection of printed emails and public notices from 5 years prior. He read through them, and the final piece of the puzzle, the deep, personal root of Carol's vendetta, clicked into place. It wasn't just about a developer's kickback. It was much older than that. The documents detailed a rezoning petition that had been submitted to the town council. A small, local developer, a Mr. Peterson, Carol's husband, had wanted to rezone the commercial lot behind their neighborhood to build a strip mall. The proposal would have dramatically increased traffic and noise, and it was deeply unpopular with the residents. The emails showed that the person who had organized the opposition, who had gone door to door with petitions, who had spoken eloquently and persuasively at the town council meeting, and who had ultimately succeeded in getting the petition denied, was Maria Morgan. Her efforts had saved the neighborhood's tranquility, but had also led to the financial ruin of Mr. Peterson's small development business. John leaned back in his chair, the papers resting in his lap. Carol's campaign against him wasn't a recent scheme. It was a long simmering, deeply personal grudge. Her ascent to the HOA presidency hadn't been an accident of ambition. It was a calculated move to gain the power she needed to exact revenge on the family she blamed for her husband's failure. The trellis was just the excuse, the first available weapon in a war she had been planning for years. He looked out the window at the garden, at the silhouette of the trellis against the twilight sky. Maria had fought a battle to protect her community, and, in the end, he had fought a battle to protect her memory. He finally understood that they had both been fighting the very same war.